So you're interested in playing Trench Crusade, but where do you even start? Perhaps you're overwhelmed with what faction to begin. Truthfully, you can play them all, as this game is incredibly affordable. But the question still remains, where do you begin? In this video, I'm going to rank the best factions for beginners in terms of playability. This is not a most meta faction video, but rather a video on the most beginner-friendly factions that can get you familiar with the game before moving on to another. I'll also touch on a couple of things that make each faction unique. Important to note, if you think a faction looks cool and you are set on playing it, definitely do so. No matter what I say in this video, I think the rule of cool should always take precedence. That being said, let's get into it. I believe that the Heretic Legion is the best faction for beginners, as they offer a bit of everything for every style of play, while not having any inherent synergy that you have to be concerned with as a new player. They have a great selection of melee units, long-range models, and everything in between. Their base equipment is pretty straightforward with nothing too quirky to worry about. Some of the abilities on certain models can be a bit more complicated, but I feel this is beneficial as it's important to slowly build up your knowledge of the more nuanced rules. If you can fully grasp the Artillery Witch, Heretic Priest, and Death Commando abilities, there's not much more complicated rules than that when it comes to the models in this faction. The Legion currently offers 3 sub-factions, 2 of which make playing the faction a bit easier. The Trench Ghosts and the Naval Raiding Party both lessen certain models you can take, which makes list building less overwhelming. They add a few rules that you have to remember, such as the extra dice for rolling actions with the Naval Raiding Party and the defensive bonuses that the Trench Ghosts get. The Knights of Avarice is the 3rd sub-faction you can opt into with the Legion, and they are just a bit more complicated than the vanilla faction. You basically get access to some more gear in the armory that has some wonky rules, such as the Golden Calf Altar and the Standard of Mammon. The Heretic Legion has a decently high skill ceiling while still maintaining a low floor, making them a pretty good option for beginners. I rank the Trench Pilgrims as the 2nd best faction for beginners, since they have pretty simple yet durable models which can be very forgiving to play. That being said, there is depth in gameplay, since there's many synergies at play here with a couple of abilities that involve being close distances to certain models. The gear that the Pilgrims offer is quite simple, as they mostly just have some special armor, weapons, and equipment that can be summarized in a sentence or two, such as the Martyrdom pills that give the model that consumes them a -1 dice to the injury roll made against them. Simple, effective, and durable. The real depth comes with the abilities that some of the units have. These abilities are not difficult to understand on their own. It's just important to remember there's a lot of moving parts and synergies with other models that newer players can sometimes lose track of. For example, the War Prophet has an ability that every model within 8 inches of her can move 3 inches towards the closest enemy model, while the Castigator has the ability to pick up downed allies within 6 inches. And the Communicant needs to be 1 inch away from an ally to block any incoming damage to that ally. See what I mean? These abilities are not incredibly difficult to understand on their own. It's just important to remember how they function together, as this army is all about working together in some sort of synergistic death ball. Much like the Heretic Legion, I would say that the Pilgrims have 2 sub-factions that are quite easy to play, as they only add a few helpful rules to remember, being the Procession of the Sacred Affliction and the Cavalcade of the 10th Plague. Although, they do have one sub-faction that has a bit more detail than the others, that being the War Pilgrimage of St. Methodius. This sub-faction adds the ability to take 2 Anchorite Shrine models, but changes how they can be equipped significantly. The gear it can be equipped with does not have complicated rules, as it is mainly strong weapons or keyword giving abilities. The synergistic style that the Trench Pilgrims bring is a relatively easy composition to execute, making them a great choice. Another good faction for beginners and veterans alike is New Antioch. A friend described playing New Antioch being very similar to chess. Your yeomen are your pawns, Your heavy infantry are your rooks, your shock troopers are your knights, combat engineers are bishops, and your lieutenant is the queen. These models are simple enough on their own, but the difficulty comes in managing them all to work together. On top of that, New Antioch has their special Fire Team ability, which enables 2 models to be activated together. This provides a significant advantage over your opponents because for every fire team that you have, you basically get an extra activation over them. When attacking with a fire team, you can use a special discounted bloodbath ability titled Concentrated Attack. This ability is critical to use effectively, as it can allow you to wipe out heavy enemies in a single activation. New Antioch has some great yet simple options in terms of war gear. The most important being their machine armor, which gives a -3 armor and the ability of treating downs as minor wounds. Now, one of the big things that can make them overwhelming for newer players is the insane amount of sub-factions they have. Most of these variants are pretty simple to understand, but the sheer quantity makes the decision difficult. Abyssinia is shooting and melee focus. The Prussians offer one of the best melee weapons in the game, being the anti-tank splitter, alongside buffed grenades. Also very good in melee and mid-range. Red Brigade is very fast with their unique War Dog options. They generate a large amount of glory, so these guys are incredibly valuable in campaign. Alba buffs machine armor and gives a special musical instrument known as bagpipes, which ignore fear within the 4-inch aura. Papal Forces is glory focused, meaning they index more towards mercenaries and glory gear rather than ducat options. They are permanently at a 200 ducat reduction. Eerie Rangers are slippery yet lightly armored, which makes them the most difficult of the bunch to play. New Antioch is one of the most popular factions for a very good reason. They look great, have many options for customization, and are a reasonably strong faction. Although it can be slightly overwhelming for a beginner, I still think this is a good option to start out with. The Iron Sultanate holds a lot of their power in their gear compared to other factions. They are the gunline faction of Trench Crusade, but do have a couple formidable melee choices as well. The Sultanate easily has the most unique base gear, including defensive equipment options and multiple ranged weapons that can go on both infantry and elites. Just to give you an idea of their ranged power, they basically have their own artillery witch via the Murad Bombard, which has a 36-inch range with blast. They also have gear that is specifically unique to the Brazen Bull, the beefiest unit in their warband. The Assassin is one of the most rules-complex models in the game. Slippery and deadly, this model enjoys playing on a knife's edge. Both the Defenders of the Iron Wall and Cabal of Assassins subfactions switch how some model stat lines work and add additional equipment to the base faction. This only increases the insane equipment that the Sultanate has. The Cabal is more melee focused, while the Defenders are ranged focused. Arguably the most bizarre thing about the Sultanate is the Takwin creature, coming from the House of Wisdom subfaction. This creature, also known as the Homunculus, is essentially a build-your-own model as it starts out completely bare bones with very little modifiers or abilities. You can't even put gear on it until you give it one of the many alchemical formulas. The alchemical formulas are abilities that you would tack onto your Homunculus. This could be something as simple as giving them the ability to hold weapons from the armory with the Human Hands formula. Or you could feed it something like the Gargantuan Size formula, which would increase its base size to 60 millimeters and give it the ability to use a Brazen Bull weapon. There are a total of 15 formulas you can equip on this Homunculus, making this the most modular unit in the game. Alongside the Homunculus, you also get some additional abilities for your alchemists in the House of Wisdom subfaction. The Iron Sultanate can play a bit cagey, being that their strength isn't ranged, but it really depends on how you want to build your list. The equipment options can be overwhelming for newer players, and the Takwin creature is a different beast in his own right. For these reasons, I rank them as the third toughest faction to play for beginners. The Black Grail are the second toughest faction for beginners, as they rely heavily on detailed list building. They have important gear such as the Compound Eyes helmet and Grail Devotee, that can go on several models, which can be overwhelming deciding which one to put it on. Grail does not do very well in ranged, and struggles with morale since their popular infantry unit is prone to dying in waves. Both of these factors can be difficult to manage for newer players. This army is incredibly modular in their gear and model selection, as several of their core models have a wide variety of customization, such as the Herald of Beelzebub, Fly Thrall, and Grail Thrall. I will say the thing that makes them difficult is the same thing that makes them fun to play. They are one of the most customizable base factions, even though they only have one sub-faction currently. The game plan changes with every variation of this faction, and for beginners, finding the game plan is one of the most difficult things to understand. They aren't really a grab-and-go faction, they require thought behind each list before you play them. They also have a unique mechanic in infection markers, which work like blood markers, the only difference being an infection marker grows by 1 whenever the model holding one is activated. The Dirge subfaction adds an additional mechanic of controlling your thralls for an extra turn at the expense of an infection marker. This ability needs to be managed well, as you can run out of infection markers quickly if you aren't being careful. Most of their war gear is pretty straightforward, save for the Locust Spitter. This is one of the most insane weapons in the game that can only be used in campaign. It allows you to hit an opponent's entire army if they aren't careful with positioning, because anytime you hit an enemy with the Locust Spitter, you pick another target within that range and hit it without having to roll for the hit action again. You then subtract the distance from model to model until you use all 24 inches or until there's no more targetable models. Grail Brain is a very real thing, in that many Black Grail players are used to playing around their weird playstyle, and when they jump to another faction, it feels like a completely different game. The most difficult faction currently in Trench Crusade is the Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent. Court has a unique mechanic unlike anything in the game called Goetic Powers. These powers are special abilities that cost blood markers from enemy or ally models without the demonic keyword. These abilities can either be used as actions or passive spells. It will specify in the description of the spell. These powers can range from shooting a fireball at enemies to teleporting from one piece of terrain to another. When creating your court list, you will pick one of the 7 deadly sins, which acts as a bit of a sub-faction. Each sin has a unique set of goetic spells, which adds even more layers to this faction. These sins vary in difficulty, but honestly most of them can get a little complicated. Each sin is thematic to the spells it gets. Wrath makes you better in melee. Envy cheats by tweaking core rules. Lust messes with blood marker allocation and can force enemy models to come closer to you. Pride makes your warband more resilient. Sloth changes how blood markers affect actions. Gluttony also is resilient, but in different ways. This sin also has the ability to force an enemy to eat a piece of its own equipment, which is just incredibly on brand. And finally, Greed buffs your models in various ways. As you probably noticed, the court has a lot of the same difficulties that the Black Grail does, being that they have so many options. But that also makes them a very great faction to play, with seemingly limitless customization. They also have an interesting way to farm blood markers, as they are the battery that charge goetic spells. The Yoke Fiend is a model whose sole purpose is to sit in a corner and whip a wretched to put blood markers on it. Not an incredibly complicated strategy, yet it is a weird one that doesn't translate to any other faction. This faction has some of the coolest models in the game, but they have such a daunting rule set. Don't let that dissuade you from trying them out, because once you get the hang of it, you can become a menace in the trenches. Yeah, I know, I said this wasn't a strongest faction video. I hope this helped some of you narrow down your search on what faction to start. Remember, all of this is my opinion, so don't take my word as gospel. That's it. Thanks for watching.
So